January 1920. Berlin. Hugo Stinnes walks into a bank and borrows an enormous sum in Reichsmarks. He already knows what those marks are worth. He already knows what they will be worth in 3 years. He buys a coal mine, then a shipping line, then a newspaper. He will repay every debt in currency worth less than the paper it is printed on. This is not speculation. This was Germany 1920. Here's what blows people's minds. Stinnes did not beat hyperinflation by predicting chaos better than everyone else. He moved earlier inside a mechanism the state had already built years before the public understood what it meant. On 4 August 1914, Germany's emergency bank laws suspended gold redemption, widened Reichsbank lending, and opened a path for paper expansion that looked temporary at first. It was not temporary. It was the legal foundation of the later disaster. Economic historian Stephanie Gross, in War Finance, Germany, shows that those laws effectively removed Germany from the gold standard while preserving the appearance of monetary continuity. Deutsche Bundesbank's historical review makes the later result plain. By November 1923, inflation had almost completely wiped out mark-denominated financial assets and liabilities. And that is the first inversion. This story is not mainly about prices rising. It is about sequence. Who got credit first? Who got out first? Who stayed in paper? Stinnes had been a major industrial operator long before the terminal phase. After the war, he expanded aggressively through new borrowing and foreign finance into oil, paper, chemicals, transport, and newspapers. He was not hiding in cash. He was converting claims into things. Verify, exact January 1920 transaction date, and first acquisition sequence, 1919 to 1921. And while men like that were building acquisition machines, another man in Berlin was moving the other direction. Maximilian Bern, an old saver, a bank account, 100,000 marks. In 1923, he withdrew his life savings. Frederick Taylor records what happened next. The money bought him one subway ticket. He rode through his city, went home, and died of starvation. That is the transaction we are examining, not theory, transfer. But to understand why Stinnes mattered, you have to go back before the wheelbarrows, before the trillion-mark notes, before the famous photographs, back to the beginning of the knowledge gap. August 1914. Germany enters war. The Reichsbank suspends gold convertibility. The state launches the gold collection drives that would later be remembered through the slogan, "Gold Gebisch für Eisen." I gave gold for iron. Wedding rings, family jewelry, coins, small private reserves. They were surrendered in exchange for patriotic substitutes and public honor. Not at gunpoint. Voluntarily. Under pressure, yes. Under propaganda, certainly. But still voluntarily, as Avner offered documents in the First World War, an agrarian interpretation, and as wartime German monetary records show. The state needed metal, needed confidence, and needed the public to keep believing that paper claims would hold. So it recruited trust first. That is the buried crime scene, not the printing press by itself, the preparation of the public mind. Because once you surrender gold at the front end of the cycle, you enter the collapse with fewer exits, fewer escape valves, fewer private reserves outside the banking system, and meanwhile, men closer to industry, exports, coal, steel, shipping, and credit lines are playing a different game entirely. They are not exchanging gold for iron. They are moving into foreign exchange, inventory, land, machinery, rolling stock, equity stakes, and anything that can still command value across borders. Same country, different map. And this is where most retellings become dishonest. They imply everyone faced the same inflation and some people merely navigated it better. No, the forensic records suggest different classes of German society entered the inflation with radically different tools, radically different information, and radically different institutional access. You can see it in the contrast. A patriotic household gives up a wedding ring in 1914, because the state says the sacrifice is honorable and temporary. An industrial empire increases leverage because depreciating currency will later erase the real burden of debt. Both acts are legal. Only one preserves purchasing power, and that difference compounds. By 1922 and 1923, the middle class is discovering that what looked like prudence was actually entrapment. Salaries lag prices, insurance policies become jokes, savings accounts turn into receipts for a vanished world. Frederick Taylor, in The Downfall of Money, describes Berliners racing to spend wages before lunchtime because an afternoon delay could destroy real value. Not to invest, to survive, to eat, to heat a room, to buy shoes before the price changed again. So when Stinnes borrows, he is not surfing chaos. He is standing on the correct side of a prearranged fracture, and on the other side of that fracture sits Maximilian Bern. Maximilian Bern was not a fool. That matters. He was a poet, translator, journalist, an educated man in Berlin. In 1923, he went to his bank and withdrew 100,000 marks, the savings of a lifetime. Frederick Taylor's account, summarized by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, records what happened next. The money bought him a single underground ticket. Soon after, Bern died of starvation. Sit with that for a second, because this is where people still hide from the mechanism. They say hyperinflation was chaos, a storm, an equal opportunity disaster. But Bern's case shows something colder. He held the kind of claim the official system tells you to trust: a bank balance, a nominal sum, a lifetime of prudence converted into digits. And when the currency failed, the digits remained. The value did not. Now put Bern on one side of Berlin, put Stinnes on the other. By 1923, Hugo Stinnes owned or controlled an empire stretching across mines, steelworks, shipping, hotels, newspapers, engineering firms, shipyards, timber mills, pulp plants, and hundreds upon hundreds of affiliated enterprises. Peter Herz, writing for the European Root of Industrial Heritage, notes that he used inflation to expand by borrowing heavily in marks and repaying later in depreciated currency. Frederick Taylor's historical paper on the Great Inflation describes the result even more starkly. By 1923, Stinnes had interests in roughly 4,500 enterprises. Same monetary event, opposite outcome. And the crucial difference was not intelligence in the abstract. It was position. If you were a salaried saver, a pensioner, a policyholder, or someone with mark claims fixed on paper, inflation attacked the thing you thought was safety. If you were leveraged into coal, ships, warehouses, timber, factories, newsprint, export goods, and foreign receipts, inflation attacked your liabilities instead. One side watched purchasing power evaporate. The other watched debt evaporate. That is why the life insurance case matters so much in this story, not as sentiment, as measurement. A bank deposit tells you what the system promises. A subway ticket tells you what it delivers. And this is the week-by-week transfer the camera has to stay on. Stinnes does not need the public to understand the mechanism. In fact, he benefits from their misunderstanding. The longer people keep treating paper claims as stored value, the longer hard assets remain purchasable with borrowed marks. The delay is the opportunity. The confusion is the spread. So when you hear that Stinnes used inflation, be precise. He was not merely surviving a collapse. He was operating a conversion engine inside it. Borrow in paper. Buy in reality. Hold outside the unit when possible. We pay after the unit breaks. Bern discovered the mechanism at the end. Stinnes was using it near the beginning. By this point, the myth becomes very comforting. One brilliant operator, one extraordinary gamble, one man who saw further than the crowd. But the record points somewhere less romantic. Stinnes did not rise out of a vacuum. He was embedded in a dense world of banks, supervisory boards, industrial combines, and cross-linked financing relationships that long predated the final inflationary break. The older banking record shows him tied to the Dresdner Bank, A. Schaffhausen Share Bank Fering, the Mittelrheinische Bank, and the Darmstadter Bank, with those relationships deepening through mining and heavy industry reorganizations before the Weimar blow-off phase. In one 1905 coal and steel combination, Deutsche Bank, Diskonto-Geschaft, Dresdner Bank, and Schaffhausen-Scheer Bankverein were drawn into a joint undertaking that also enhanced the power of Stinnes and August Stischen. This is not proof of a secret cabal. It is proof that he operated inside institutional plumbing most depositors never even saw. And that matters because inflation does not reward everyone who notices prices rising. It rewards access to balance sheets, access to refinancing, access to foreign exchange, access to the next loan before the last one is turned to ash. The state had already built part of that machinery in 1914. Once convertibility was suspended, the Reichsbank could accept treasury paper as reserve. The tax on excessive note issue was abolished, and the Darlingskassen loan banks were created to push credit into business and public bodies. The public was encouraged to hand over gold and subscribe savings. Business, meanwhile, was being kept liquid through an expanding credit structure. So the divide was never simply smart versus stupid. It was institutional inclusion versus institutional exposure. Now add the external valve. Swiss financial historian Christoph Farke shows that Switzerland absorbed very large amounts of German wealth during 1919 to 1923, functioning as an offshore center for German capital during the inflationist years. And he notes one detail too perfect to ignore. In 1919, Hugo Stinnes created a letterbox company in Zug to manage the assets of his Alpine Mountain concern. That does not, by itself, prove the full vault to gold sequence often repeated in popular retellings. So we should be careful. Every specific Swiss gold custody arrangements and vault accounts directly attributable to Stinnes. Faute. But it does confirm the essential pattern. Part of the German industrial elite was not trapped inside the mark system. It was building channels around it. And once you see that, the instrument becomes brutally simple. Borrow in marks. Buy mines, mills, ships, paper, hotels, timber, freight capacity. Use export exposure and foreign links where possible. Shift what can be shifted outside the collapsing unit. Then wait. Not passively, strategically. Because every month the mark weakened, the real burden of yesterday's debt fell. Every time a saver delayed conversion, real assets became cheaper in paper terms for the buyer with credit. Every time the public kept believing their account balance was a store of value, the acquisition window stayed open a little longer. The misunderstanding was productive. For somebody, this is also where Carl Friedrich von Siemens belongs in the story, but with discipline. He was a major industrial and political figure in early Weimar Germany. The broader literature confirms his prominence in the same elite corporate political world. Every direct documented evidence of coordinated Stinnes von Siemens acquisition strategy in the inflation years. So the stronger claim is not that every industrialist moved in lockstep. It is that Stinnes was one visible expression of a wider class position. Large industrial actors with banking access, board-level visibility, and better escape routes than you had. And that is why this was legal. Not because it was harmless, because the mechanism was embedded in the system before the public recognized the transaction. Then came the reversal, not the moral reversal, the monetary one. In November 1923, the German state finally stopped the collapse. Hjalmar Schacht, first as currency commissioner and then as Reichsbank president, helped drive the stabilization program that introduced the Rentenmark and ended the terminal inflation spiral. The exact dating is a little messy in popular retellings because some references emphasize 15 November and others 20 November for circulation and formal rollout. The safe point is this. In mid to late November 1923, Germany imposed a new monetary discipline, and the old game changed. And here is the part most people miss. Stabilization did not reverse the transfer. It ratified it. If you were Maximilian Bern, a new unit of account did not restore the destroyed purchasing power of the old one. Your savings were not resurrected. Your life insurance contract did not become whole again. The paper had already failed in real terms. The reset merely stopped the bleeding after the organ was gone. That is why the Renton mark should not be narrated as a rescue in any simple moral sense. It was a settlement, a line drawn after the winners had already acquired, and the losers had already been cashed out. For Stinnes, that same moment carried a different meaning. The inflation engine that had favored leveraged acquisition was over. Debt could no longer be quietly liquefied month after month through currency decay. An empire built to expand inside a collapsing unit now had to function inside a harder one. And that exposed the structural flaw. Stinnes had assembled an immense conglomerate through leverage, but stabilization demanded operating coherence, liquidity discipline, and sustainable earnings rather than monetary tailwind. Cambridge's business history summary is blunt. He overstretched financially, and his vast empire collapsed soon after his death on 10 April 1924. Economic historian Isabel Schnabel likewise refers to the collapse of the Stinnes Empire in 1925 when tracing German financial fragility after stabilization. So the official story, crisis, reform, recovery, conceals the actual sequence. First, inflation destroys paper claims. Then, stabilization preserves the new ownership map. Then, only afterward, the language of order returns. That is why this chapter matters now, because people are taught to watch the crash. They should be watching the lock-in. So what is the document in this story? Not the bank ledger, not the balance sheet, not even the stabilization decree. The wedding ring, because the ring tells you where the transfer began. It shows you the moment private protection was surrendered into a public promise. First, the state asks for trust. Then it expands paper. Then credit reaches the actors closest to industry, finance, and foreign earnings before the public understands what is happening. Then the language changes. Sacrifice, emergency, liquidity, stabilization, different words, same sequence. The forensic pattern in Weimar is that those nearest the credit spigot could convert depreciating liabilities into durable claims on mines, mills, ships, and newsprint, while savers and policyholders discovered too late that nominal wealth is not usable wealth. And that is the reason this story still matters. Not because you should look for another Hugo Stinnes, because you should look for the mechanism. Who is borrowing most aggressively inside the weakening unit? What are they buying with it? What cash flows sit outside that unit? And what temporary emergency language is persuading the public to part with the few assets that would survive the break? Be careful here. The lesson is not that every inflation ends in Weimar. It does not. The lesson is narrower and more useful. When paper claims are quietly losing integrity, the most important divide is not optimism versus pessimism. It is paper versus access. Promise versus control, account balance versus usable asset. So the binary choice is the same now as it was then. Learn to read who is borrowing in the failing unit and what they are buying, or stay on the donation side of the transaction.